the single silver dollar pressed against Sarah Blackwell's palm so hard it left a ring in her skin, and she stared at it the entire 3-day train ride west like it might multiply if she looked away long enough. She had not chosen this. She wanted to be very clear about that, at least to herself, since there was no one sitting beside her on that rattling bench seat who cared one way or the other. She had not chosen to be sent from the Illinois orphanage at 22 years old with a dollar coin, a canvas sack containing 2 dresses, a hairbrush, and a letter of introduction addressed to a man she had never met. She had not chosen the stitched name inside the collar of her gray wool dress either, the careful block letters that read Sarah Blackwell in dark blue thread, the kind of stitching the matrons did so that the children's belongings would not get mixed up in the laundry. She was not a child anymore, but the dress had been given to her by the matrons when her old one finally split at the seams beyond repair, and apparently old habits in institutions died hard. The year was 1873, and the Kansas plains rolled past the smudged window in waves of yellow and brown grass that bent under a September wind. The sky above was enormous, larger than anything she had seen growing up in Chicago and then in the institutional gray of the Elmwood home for women, and it should have felt like freedom, but instead it felt like exposure. Like standing in the middle of a field with no walls anywhere near you and realizing the walls had been the only thing you understood. The letter in her sack was addressed to one Gerald Marsh of Caldwell, Kansas. It said he was a farmer of good standing who had corresponded with the home's administrator, Mrs. Pryor, and had agreed to take in a young woman of good character for the purposes of employment as a housekeeper. Mrs. Pryor had explained it carefully, with her hands folded on the desk and her tone suggesting there was nothing unusual about any of this, which was how Sarah knew there was something unusual about all of it. "There is opportunity in the West for women of industry," Mrs. Pryor had said. "You are not getting any younger, Miss Blackwell, and the home cannot support you indefinitely. This is a respectable arrangement." Sarah had not argued. She never argued. She had learned a long time ago that arguing in an institution got you nothing except fewer meals and more chores. So she sat on the train with her dollar, and her name stitched inside her collar and her 2 dresses in the canvas sack, watching Kansas unfold outside the window, trying to believe that something good might be waiting at the end of the line. The train pulled into Caldwell just after noon on a Thursday in the middle of September 1873. The depot was a single-room building with a sagging porch and a hand-painted sign that someone had nailed slightly crooked. Sarah stepped off the platform and stood in the main street of the town, which was dusty and wide, and lined on both sides with wooden-fronted buildings. A general store, a livery stable, a hotel with a second-floor porch, a barber shop, a saloon with the piano going even at this hour, and a sheriff's office with a sun-faded star painted above the door. It smelled of horse and hay, and something faintly sweet that she could not identify and would later learn was the molasses being processed at the grain store at the end of the street. She stood there holding her canvas sack and her letter and her dollar coin, and she looked up and down the street, and no one came to meet her. She waited 20 minutes. The sun was direct and warm, and she was aware of the looks she received from the men moving up and down the boardwalk, the curious tilt of their heads at the young woman standing alone near the depot with a sack and a letter and nowhere obvious to go. After 30 minutes, she walked into the general store because it seemed like the kind of place where someone might know Gerald Marsh of Caldwell. The store smelled of coffee and leather and dried goods. It was dim inside after the brightness of the street, and she stood for a moment while her eyes adjusted, and that was when she first saw him. He was standing at the counter with his back to her, talking to the man behind the register. He was tall, with dark hair that curled at the back of his neck below the brim of a brown cattleman hat, and he was wearing a canvas work coat over a blue chambray shirt. He had the kind of shoulders that spoke of genuine physical labor, not performance, and he was gesturing with one hand while the other rested on the counter, and whatever he was saying was making the man behind the register laugh. Sarah approached the counter and waited politely, because that was what she had been taught, and after a moment the tall man turned, apparently sensing someone behind him, and she got her first full look at his face. He was perhaps 28 or 29, brown-skinned from the sun, with dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something stubborn. There was a scar above his left eyebrow, pale and thin, and his nose had been broken at least once. He was not beautiful in the way that paintings in church parlors were beautiful, but he was striking in a way that made her look twice and then feel slightly embarrassed for doing so. He looked at her with straightforward curiosity and touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon, ma'am." "Good afternoon," she said. "I am looking for a man named Gerald Marsh. I was told he farms out of Caldwell." The man behind the counter, whose name she would later learn was Pete Gallagher, made a sound in his throat that was not quite a laugh and not quite something sadder. The tall man's expression changed too, something shifting behind his eyes. "Gerald Marsh," the tall man said, and his voice had gone careful. "You have business with him. I have a letter of introduction from an institution in Illinois. He has agreed to employ me as a housekeeper." There was a pause that stretched about 3 seconds too long, and in those 3 seconds Sarah understood, with the clarity that years of institutional living had given her for reading rooms and silences, that something was wrong. "I am sorry to tell you," the man behind the counter said, "that Gerald Marsh passed on about 6 weeks ago. Horse kicked him in the chest. He was dead before Doc Hensley could get to him." The dollar in her pocket suddenly felt lighter than it had before, if that was possible. "I see," Sarah said. She said it very calmly because she was very good at saying things calmly when she was in fact cataloging the dimensions of a problem at considerable internal speed. She had $1. She had 2 dresses. She was in Caldwell, Kansas, which was several hundred miles from anyone who had ever known her name. The institution in Illinois had already filled her bunk. She was quite sure of that. Mrs. Pryor was not a woman who left bunks empty for long. "Is there a boarding house in town?" she asked. "Somewhere that takes in women." "Mrs. Hale takes in boarders," Pete Gallagher said, "but she charges $2 a week." $2 a week. She had $1 total. "Thank you," she said, and she was turning to leave when the tall man spoke. "You just came in on the train from the east?" "Yes," she said. "Traveling alone?" "Yes." He looked at her for another moment, the dark eyes steady and unhurried. "My name is Warren Redmond," he said. "I have a cattle operation about 4 miles north of town. I run it with my foreman, a man named Hector Reyes, and we have been needing a cook and someone to keep the household for some months. If you are interested in honest work, the pay is $8 a month, and there is a room in the main house." She looked at him. He looked back at her without flinching. "Why would you offer that to a stranger?" she asked, because she had learned in 22 years that offers from strangers required examination before acceptance. "Because you are clearly not going to make it a week on whatever is in that sack, and because I need a cook," he said. "And because Gerald Marsh was a decent man who would not have wanted someone he made an arrangement with to end up stranded. I knew him. He was my neighbor." It was the mention of Gerald Marsh that decided her. It made Warren Redmond a part of a story she already knew, a thread connected to something, which was better than a stranger who had appeared from nowhere. "My name is Sarah Blackwell," she said. "I know," he said, and then he seemed to catch himself and added, "You just introduced yourself in connection with the Marsh arrangement." She had not actually. She had not given her name at all. But she filed that small discrepancy away and said, "I accept. Thank you, Mr. Redmond." The Redmond cattle operation was exactly 4 miles north of town, along a wagon road that wound through grass and low hills. The main house was a 2-story structure built of limestone, which was common in that part of Kansas, with a covered porch running the length of the front and a kitchen addition off the back. There was a bunkhouse for the hands, a barn, a smokehouse, and a well with a wooden cover, And there was a kitchen garden along the south side of the house that had gone somewhat to weeds in the absence of consistent tending. Hector Reyes was a compact man in his mid-30s with a weathered face and a way of moving that suggested he was always economizing his motion, and he shook her hand when Warren introduced them and said, "Thank God. I have been cooking for 6 months and I am a terrible cook," which made Warren snort and Sarah almost smile. The room they gave her was on the first floor, off the kitchen, small but clean, with a window that looked south toward the garden, and a quilt on the narrow bed in blues and yellows that someone had made with considerable skill. "Whose quilt is this?" she asked, running her fingers along the neat stitching. Warren, who had been standing in the doorway of the small room, looked at it for a moment. "My mother's," he said. "She passed 3 years ago. She would have wanted it used." "I will take care of it," Sarah said, and she meant it. She spent the first evening taking stock of the kitchen, which was well equipped by frontier standards. There was a good iron range, a solid work table, a pie safe with pierced tin panels, and a larder that was reasonably stocked. Someone had been trying, that much was clear, but trying without skill or system, which produced the kind of result where nothing was quite where it should be and everything tasted slightly wrong. She made supper that first night from what she found: salt pork, dried beans that had been soaking since that morning apparently on Hector's optimistic initiative, cornbread from a starter she found on the back shelf, and a dried apple pudding that she threw together in the last 20 minutes because she believed supper should end with something sweet if the materials existed for it. She rang the bell on the porch at 6 o'clock. Warren and Hector and 2 ranch hands, brothers named Tomás and Luis Vega, who were Hector's cousins from south of the border, came in and sat at the long kitchen table. She set the food down and began to turn back toward the stove, and Warren said, "Miss Blackwell, you eat with us." She turned around. "I am the cook," she said. "You are a member of this household," he said. "Sit down." She sat down. She was not accustomed to eating at the same table with the people she worked for. But the food was hot and there was plenty of it. And within 5 minutes of the first bite, the conversation at the table had shifted into something relaxed and easy, Hector making a joke about the beans that Tomás escalated and Louis topped, and Warren laughing with his head tilted back. And Sarah watched all of it from her end of the table and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the tentative sensation of being, possibly, in a place where she might belong. She woke the next morning before dawn, as she always had, and lit the range and started coffee, and discovered that Warren Redmond was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of water and a ledger book spread open in front of him, writing in the thin early light of the lamp. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said, and glanced up. He looked like he had slept in his clothes, or not slept at all, which she would eventually learn was a common condition during the weeks when the cattle drives were being organized, when there was more to plan than there were hours to plan it. She made the coffee without speaking because she understood instinctively that he was in the middle of something and did not want interruption, and she set a cup beside his ledger without comment and went back to making the morning biscuits. After a while he said, "You do not talk much in the mornings." "I find that most people do not want me to," she said. "You are probably right about most people," he said. "I do not mind talking in the mornings." She looked at him over her shoulder. "What were you writing?" "Cattle counts. We are sending a herd north to Abilene in 3 weeks. There is a buyer from Illinois coming in who will take 200 head if the condition is right." "A buyer from Illinois," she said. It caught her attention, the smallness of the world suddenly apparent, the long threads connecting places. "Do you know Illinois?" he asked. "I grew up there, mostly in Chicago and then at an institution called the Elmwood Home, which is north of the city." She paused. "I do not expect you know it." "I do not," he said, "but I am sorry you grew up in an institution." He said it plainly, without the strained pity that people usually produced when they learned about her background, the kind that made her feel like a specimen. "It was not always bad," she said, because that was true. Mrs. Caldecott, the cook, Taught me everything I know about making food. She had been a hotel cook in St. Louis before her husband died and she had to go somewhere. And what happened to Mrs. Caldecott? She died when I was 16. After that, the cooking was done by a woman named Mrs. Prine who boiled everything until it asked for mercy. She said it without thinking and then was surprised to hear him laugh, a genuine startled laugh, not the polite version. That is the best description of bad cooking I have ever heard, he said. She turned back to her biscuits to hide that she was smiling. The weeks settled into a rhythm. She cooked 3 meals a day and kept the house in order, which required more effort than might be apparent to someone who had not walked into a household that had been running on male stubbornness and minimum necessary effort for 6 months. She washed curtains and mended shirts and reorganized the pantry and cleared the kitchen garden of its worst weeds, though the season was too far gone for much of a crop. She kept the accounts of what was needed from town and gave Warren her lists every Saturday, which was when he or Hector rode in. She was not unhappy. She noticed that. She had been braced for unhappiness, had been carrying its expectation like ballast against the risk of being surprised by it, and it was strange and slightly disorienting to find that she was instead waking up each morning with something that functioned like purpose. What she did not examine too carefully in those first weeks was the way she paid attention to Warren Redmond, the way she knew, without looking up from her work, when he walked into the kitchen, the way she had memorized, without intending to, the particular sound of his boots on the porch boards versus Hector's shuffle or the heavier tread of the Vega brothers. The way conversations with him were different from conversations with anyone else she had known, because he listened like he was actually interested, like what she said mattered beyond its usefulness to him. There was an afternoon in the second week when she was in the garden pulling the last of the late-season squash, and he came around the side of the house and stopped when he saw her, and stood there for a moment before he said anything. And she looked up and caught the expression on his face before he had a chance to arrange it into something more neutral. And what she saw there made her look quickly back down at the squash. It was the third Saturday when things shifted, though not in the way she might have anticipated. She had baked pies that morning, apple and dried cherry, and they were cooling on the windowsill, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of cinnamon, and the particular sweetness of rendered butter. And she was thinking about nothing in particular when Warren came back from town earlier than expected, came through the front door without his usual warning of boots on the porch steps, and walked into the kitchen with a look on his face that she had not seen before. He stopped when he saw her. He was holding something in his hand, a piece of paper, the letter she had given him weeks ago for safekeeping when she was organizing the household documents, her letter of introduction from Mrs. Pryor. She had not thought of it in some time. "Sarah," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name without the formal address, and something about the way he said it carefully like it was breakable made her set down the rolling pin she had been cleaning. "What is wrong?" she said. He held up the letter. "I read this again today going over the Marsh correspondence." "Yes," she said, "and your name in this letter." He paused. He was looking at her with an expression that was doing several things at once, troubled and wondering and something else she could not name. "Miss Blackwell, what do you know about your parents?" She had not expected that question. Of all the directions a conversation could go, that was not one she had mapped. "I know very little," she said carefully. "I was brought to the Elmwood home when I was 4 years old. The record said my mother had died and my father was unknown. My name, they told me, came from the woman who brought me in, who gave my mother's name as Catherine Blackwell." Warren sat down in the kitchen chair, which was not like him. He was not a man who sat down suddenly. He was a man who moved with deliberate intention, and the sudden sitting was alarming. "Catherine Blackwell," he said. "Yes," she said. "Did you know her?" "She was my mother's sister," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. The pies on the windowsill steamed gently in the September afternoon. A horse in the paddock made a distant sound. "Your mother's sister," Sarah said slowly. "My mother was Margaret Redmond, born Margaret Blackwell in Ohio. Her sister was Catherine Blackwell, who never married, who moved to Chicago in the late 1850s. My mother talked about her. She stopped getting letters from Catherine around 1855 or 1856, which was when my mother and father came west. She always wondered what happened to Catherine. He looked at the letter, then at her. If Catherine brought you in at age 4, and you are 22 now, that means she brought you in sometime around 1855. Sarah's hands had gone still on the rolling pin. She was doing the arithmetic and she did not like where it was landing, or rather she liked it very much and was frightened of liking it because she had been disappointed before. "Are you saying," she said, "that your mother and my mother were sisters?" "I am saying that your mother appears to have been my mother's sister, which would make you and me first cousins." He looked up at her and then something happened on his face, something she could not quite read, a complicated layering of emotion. "Except that you are not from here and I did not know you existed until 6 weeks ago when I read this letter for the first time and saw the name Blackwell." She put the rolling pin down on the table with great care. "When I stepped off the train," she said, "you told me you knew my name, but I had not introduced myself." He was quiet for a moment. "I read the collar," he said. She stared at him. "The collar. When you were standing at the counter, you had your back to me for a moment, and your collar was turned up at the back because of the wind from the door, and I could see the stitching. Sarah Blackwell. I thought I misread it. I thought it was a coincidence. And then you said your name and the letter confirmed it. But I did not say anything right away because I needed to think about whether I was right." She felt something move through her chest that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but was located somewhere between them, in the territory of things that have been lost a long time and are found in a form that is not quite what you expected. "You went pale," she said, and she was remembering now the odd pause when she had said her name, the careful way his expression had moved. "At the counter, when I said my name, you went pale." "I did," he said, "because you recognized it. Because I recognized it." He set the letter on the table. "I do not know what this means for you, but my mother spoke of Catherine with real love and she grieved the loss of connection with her. She died not knowing what became of her sister. If you are Catherine's girl, then you are family." The word family landed in Sarah's chest like a stone thrown in deep water, sending ripples to places she had not known were still open to being touched. She sat down in the chair across from him. She was not a woman who cried easily. The years had taken that particular reflex and worn it down to a minimum, but her eyes were full right now and she was working hard to keep them from overflowing. "I have not had family," she said. "Not that I can remember." "I know," he said. He said it quietly, gently, and he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, which was a gesture so simple and so human that it was the hand she could not control, the one she had worked so hard not to let tip over, and her eyes filled completely. She did not cry at length. She was not built for long crying. But she let herself have the moment, the full quiet weight of it, the understanding that she had arrived at this table by train and dollar and stitched name and the long accident of history, and she was here. And there was someone across from her who was connected to her by blood and who was covering her hand with his as if it was the most natural gesture in the world. When she composed herself, she said, practically, because she was at her core a practical woman, "Does this change the arrangement? Am I still your cook?" He looked startled by the question and then he laughed, low and warm. "Of course you are still my cook. The biscuits alone are worth keeping you here regardless of bloodline." She laughed too, a little unsteadily, and pulled her hand back and picked up the rolling pin again because she needed something to do with herself. But things had changed between them, whether she quite admitted it yet or not. The information about their families, the revelation of the connection, should have created a certain kind of comfortable ease between them, the ease of known relations, of cousins learning each other. And it did, in part. Meals became more conversational. He began to tell her things about the history of the land, the cattle operation, his father who had died when Warren was 19 and left him the ranch at too young an age, the years of building it to what it was now. She told him things about the Elmwood home, about Mrs. Caldecott and her hotel cooking, about the winter when she was 12 and there had been a fire in the East Wing, and all the girls had stood in the yard in the snow while the men put it out. Small stories, the accumulation of a life. But there was also something else building alongside the comfort of family, something that was categorically and unmistakably not the feeling you had about a cousin, and Sarah knew it and did not know what to do with it, and so she did what she always did with things that were complicated, which was to continue making excellent meals and keep the house in very good order and not look at it directly. The problem was that Warren was not doing the same. He was not being subtle about the looking. He looked at her the way a man looked at a woman when he was trying to decide something, which she recognized because the few male staff members at the Elmwood home had on occasion looked at the female matrons that way, though she had not been on the receiving end of it before, and the receiving end was considerably more destabilizing than the observing end. She told herself it was the family connection, the warmth of discovering kin, that made him look at her that way. She told herself this successfully for about 2 weeks, and then Hector Reyes, who was not a subtle man but was a perceptive one, said to her one morning while Warren was out on the range, "You know he has not looked at any woman the way he looks at you since before his father died." "We are family," Sarah said, mixing the bread dough with more force than was strictly necessary. "He is my cousin in a manner of speaking." Hector was quiet for a moment. Then carefully he said, "Second cousin, maybe. Through marriage, not blood. His mother and your mother were blood sisters, yes. But that means he is your mother's nephew by marriage, or your first cousin once removed on the maternal side, depending on how you count it, and his father was not a Blackwell at all." She kept mixing the bread. She had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully at length in the narrow bed with the blue and yellow quilt pulled up to her chin in the dark. "I am employed in his house," she said. "Yes," Hector said, without judgment but without retreating. "That is complicated." "Most good things are," he said, and picked up his hat and went back outside, leaving her with the bread dough and the problem of Warren Redmond. It was a Wednesday in the middle of October when the drive to Abilene departed. 200 head of cattle, Warren and Hector and the Vega brothers and 3 additional hands hired for the drive, moving north along the Kishom Trail toward the railhead. Warren had explained all of this to her the previous day with the thoroughness of a man who wanted her to know where he was and when he would return. "It should take 12 days, he said. "Maybe 14 if the weather turns. Hector will stay here." "Hector is your foreman," she said. "He should go. Hector has been on 20 drives. Tomas Vega can manage, and I need someone I trust to stay with the property." He paused. "To stay with you." She looked up from the beans she was sorting. "Mr. Redmond," she said. "Warren," he said. She had been calling him Mr. Redmond for 5 weeks, which was appropriate and correct. He had been calling her Sarah for most of that time. The asymmetry had not escaped her. "Warren," she said, trying it, and something in his expression shifted in a way that made her drop her gaze back to the beans. "I am perfectly capable of managing for a few days. I was managing my entire life before I arrived here." "I know that," he said. "I also know that there have been incidents on the North Road with a group of men who have been taking advantage of isolated homesteads, and I will sleep considerably better on the trail if I know Hector is here." She could not argue with genuine safety concerns, and so she did not. And in the morning, Warren and the hands departed with the cattle in the gray pre-dawn, and Sarah stood on the porch and watched them go, the long, dark shape of the herd moving north against the pale sky, and felt something that she was not going to call loneliness because she had been alone for most of her life, and she was not going to be reduced to maudlin sentimentality about the temporary absence of someone she had known for 5 weeks. But the house was too quiet that first day, and she made too much food at supper, and she went to bed early with a book and could not concentrate on it. The 12 days of the drive were 12 days in which Sarah Blackwell admitted things to herself that she had been carefully not admitting. She sat with the admission the way she sat with difficult tasks, directly and without flinching. She was falling in love with Warren Redmond. This was inconvenient and probably unwise, and she was going to have to decide what to do about it. The complicating factors were numerous. She was employed by him, which created an imbalance of power that she found troubling. She had arrived as, essentially, a person with no resources, no family, no options, and he had offered her employment out of charity as much as need, and she would not have anyone mistake a dependent's gratitude for something else. She had more pride than almost anything else she owned, and she was not going to let it be said that Sarah Blackwell had attached herself to the first man who was kind to her, because she had never had kindness before. But she also could not deny what was real, and what was real was that Warren Redmond was the most genuine person she had ever met. He did not perform kindness, he practiced it. He treated Hector and the Vega brothers with the same direct respect he showed to the Illinois cattle buyer who came through with his fine coat and his superior manner. He did not talk about people behind their backs. He kept his word. He worked as hard as any man in his employ, harder on most days, and he listened to her, actually listened, when she spoke, which was rarer than it should have been, and she knew it. On the 9th day of the drive, Hector came in from checking the south fence line with his expression set in a way that told her something was wrong before he opened his mouth. "There are riders on the south road," he said. "3 of them, and they are not riding like men with somewhere to be." She had already gone to the window before he finished the sentence. She could see them, 3 figures on horseback at the edge of the property line, not moving, just sitting. "The hands Warren mentioned," she said. "I think so," Hector said. "Do not worry, I have handled worse." "I know you have," she said. "I am going to keep the rifle on the back porch." Hector looked at her with a new quality of attention. "You can shoot." "Mrs. Caldicott's husband taught everyone in the home to shoot before he died," she said. "He was from Kentucky, and he felt strongly that women ought to be able to defend themselves. Mrs. Pryor tolerated it because he did the work for free." She paused. "I am not a marksman, but I can load and fire, and I can do it accurately enough to be useful." The 3 riders came to the house an hour before dark. Hector met them on the porch with his rifle across his arm, the easy posture of a man who was not performing threat but was not pretending to be unarmed either. Sarah stood inside the front window where she could see and was not visible, the ranch rifle in her hands. The men wanted provisions, they said. Food and ammunition, just passing through. Their manner was the particular kind of friendly that is not friendly at all but is testing the ground, feeling for weakness. Hector told them, in the pleasant tone he used when he was at his most immovable, that the provisions were not available and the ranch did not keep visitors, and if they were hungry, there was a town 4 miles south with a hotel that served meals. He said it with such complete, untroubled confidence that the men, after a moment of holding their posture, seemed to recalculate and rode away back south. She set the rifle down when they were out of sight and her hands were shaking slightly, which she hid by going to the stove and putting a kettle on. "That was well done," she told Hector. "They will not come back tonight," he said. "Men like that prefer an easy mark." He sat down at the kitchen table. "You would have used that rifle?" "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "Warren made the right choice leaving me here." "He made the right choice keeping the operation running," she corrected, and went back to the supper she had been making. Hector smiled at his cup. Warren came back on the 14th day, 2 days later than expected because of rain that had slowed the herd on the final stretch. She heard the horses come into the yard in the late afternoon and went to the porch, and he was coming through the gate on his roan horse, trail dirty and visibly tired. And when he saw her on the porch, he stopped the horse and looked at her for a long moment from across the yard before he dismounted. She had meant to greet him normally, the way she would greet anyone returning from a fortnight away. She had rehearsed this in her head, the ordinary competent greeting of a housekeeper acknowledging an employer's return. Instead she said, "There was trouble while you were gone." Hector handled it, before she had quite finished deciding whether to say anything at all. He tied the horse and walked toward her with quick steps, and the tiredness had been replaced by something sharper. "What kind of trouble?" "Riders, 3 of them. They came to the house the day before yesterday at near dark. Hector turned them away without incident." He was on the porch now, close, looking at her with an intensity that was slightly overwhelming at close range. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly fine," she said. "I was never in danger." "Hector, are you all right?" he said again, more quietly, and the repetition was not impatience but the very specific concern of someone asking twice, because the first answer was not the one they were looking for. She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "I was frightened for a moment, but I kept the rifle and I was not alone. I am all right." Something released in his face, the taut line of his jaw softening. He was close enough that she was quite acutely aware of the distance between them, which was less than it was when they stood together under normal circumstances. "Good," he said, and then neither of them moved for a moment, and then he said, "Supper smells extraordinary." And the moment resolved itself back into the ordinary, and she turned and went inside to finish the meal. But that night after supper, when Hector had gone to the bunkhouse and the ranch hands were settled, Warren sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and did not go to bed, and Sarah sat across from him because she was not tired, and the evening was dark, and the lamp threw a warm circle of light, and there was something that needed to be said between them. She said it first because she was not a woman who waited for things to be said when she had decided they needed saying. "I want to be clear about something," she said, "before I lose my nerve." He looked at her with the steady, dark eyes. "I am aware of the circumstances under which I came here," she said. "That I arrived with nothing, that you employed me out of kindness as much as need, that I am in a position that is dependent on your continued goodwill. I want you to know that I am aware of it. And I also want you to know that when I say what I am about to say, it is not because of gratitude or dependence or lack of options. It is because it is true, and because I have thought about it for 5 weeks and examined it from every angle I can find, and I cannot find anything that makes it untrue." She stopped. "Go on," he said very quietly. "I care for you," she said, "more than is consistent with our professional arrangement, more than is perhaps wise given how recently I arrived here. But I have learned in 22 years of managing with very little that the honest thing is always better than the polite substitute for it, and the honest thing is that I care for you, and I wanted you to know that before it became impossible to say." The lamp flickered in a draft from somewhere. Outside, an owl made its sound against the prairie dark. Warren Redmond looked at her for a long time, the kind of looking that was going somewhere, working something out, and she sat with it because she was not afraid of his silence. She had learned his silence by now. "When I came back today and saw you on the porch," he said at last, "and you were all right, the feeling I had was not the feeling a man has for his cousin." He paused. "It was not the feeling I have had before for any other person. It was something larger, and it was particular to you, and I want to be honest about that because you deserve honesty." Her heart was doing something complicated inside her chest. "I also want to be clear about the same things you mentioned," he said. "I am not interested in a woman who stays because she has nowhere to go. If you were anywhere else in the world with other options open to you, and if you were to make this choice freely, that would mean something different and real. If you are staying because you have no alternative, I am not staying because I have no alternative," she said, with a sharpness that was not anger but was the firm pressure of someone who means what they say. "I have $1 and I have my 2 hands and I have a brain, and in 1873 a woman with those 3 things has more options than you might think if she is willing to use them. I am not staying because I cannot leave. I am sitting at this table because I want to be here." A corner of his mouth moved. "The dollar," he said. "Is it still in your pocket?" "I carry it everywhere," she said. "It is the first thing that was ever only mine." Something moved through his expression that was very tender. "Keep it," he said. "Always keep it." He reached across the table, the same gesture he had made 6 weeks ago when she had been trying not to cry, covering her hand with his. But this time it was not comfort exactly, or not only comfort. This time it was something that asked a question and waited for an answer. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and that was the answer. They did not rush anything. That was not their nature, either of them. Warren Redmond was a man who built things carefully. The ranch, the cattle operation, his own character. And Sarah Blackwell was a woman who had learned through long experience to trust things that proved themselves over time, rather than things that announced themselves loudly all at once. They moved into the new territory between them the way you might walk into a room you had only seen from the doorway, carefully, taking in the details. There were long conversations in the evenings after supper. He told her about his father, a hard-driving man named Thomas Redmond, who had built the ranch from nothing and left it to Warren at 19 with the instruction to make it better than he found it. He told her about his mother, Margaret, the laugh she had that filled rooms, the way she could tell when rain was coming 2 hours before it arrived, the quilt she made with pieces of every dress she had ever worn that was now on a narrow bed off the kitchen, and being slept under by a woman who was more of her family than she had known. Sarah told him things she had never told anyone, the small, carefully guarded things. The year she had decided to stop waiting for someone to come back for her, which was when she was 13, and the way that decision had changed her from inside, made her more solid. The dream she had allowed herself in quiet moments of having a kitchen of her own, a real kitchen, not institutional or employed but hers. The things she had taught herself from books borrowed from the Elmwood home's small library. Basic mathematics, something of history, enough geography to understand where the world's pieces were relative to each other. "You are better educated than most of the men in this county," he said one evening. "I am better educated than I have any right to be given the circumstances," she said, "which is something I take considerable private satisfaction in." He laughed. He had a good laugh, the kind that was unguarded and entirely his. "I have been writing letters to the land office in Topeka," he said a few evenings later. They were sitting on the front porch because the October evenings were still warm enough if you wore your coat, and the stars over the Kansas plain were extraordinary, the kind of display that the eastern sky with its city light never offered. About the Marsh property, Gerald Marsh's farm. He had no heirs. The property reverts to the territory unless someone makes a claim on it. "I have been thinking about expanding the grazing land." He paused. "But I have also been thinking that a separate house on that land might have another use." She looked at the stars. She understood what he was suggesting, in the careful circling way that he suggested things rather than declaring them, because Warren Redmond believed in making space for choices rather than creating situations where choices were foreclosed. "A separate house," she said. "For a family," he said, "if that became relevant." She turned her head to look at him, his profile against the dark sky, the familiar shape of his face that she had been learning for 2 months now. "Are you asking me something?" He turned to look at her too. In the darkness, with the stars behind him and the lamplight from the front window making a pale rectangle across the porch boards, he looked both completely himself and slightly unguarded in a way she found moving. "I am a practical man," he said. "I was raised to be practical. But I find that where you are concerned I keep wanting to be impractical, which is something I am not entirely accustomed to." "I find that surprising," she said. "You seem to me like a man who allows himself feeling." "For cattle and land," he said with dry humor, "less practiced at the other kind." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I would like you to ask me something." He was quiet too for a moment, and she could hear him gathering himself, the particular quality of a person who is about to say something that matters. "Sarah," he said, "would you be willing to marry me?" She had known it was coming, or something like it, and had been sitting with the possibility for weeks, turning it over in the practical part of her mind that had to be satisfied alongside every other part. She had examined the imbalance of their situations and concluded it was temporary, that she was not and would not be a dependent, that she was capable of contributing to something built together rather than arriving into something already built. She had examined her feelings and concluded they were genuine, the real durable kind and not the quick-burning kind. She had examined him as clearly as she could, which was the most important examination of all, And what she found when she looked at Warren Redmond was a man who was honest and hard-working and kind in the specific way that was not performance but practice, and who looked at her like she was something worth looking at. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He reached over and took her hand in the dark, and they sat on the porch under the Kansas stars and did not need to say anything else for a while. They were married 6 weeks later, on a Friday in the last week of November 1873, in the small Methodist church at the south end of Caldwell. The minister was a man named Reverend Gale, who had a booming voice entirely disproportionate to his small frame, and who married them with a directness and brevity that suited them both. Hector Reyes stood up with Warren, and the minister's wife, a capable woman named Ada Gale, stood up with Sarah, and Tomás and Luis Vega sat in the front pew looking extremely pleased with themselves, as if they had arranged the whole affair. Sarah wore the better of her two dresses, the navy blue one, with a piece of cream-colored ribbon at the collar that Ada Gale had pressed on her that morning. Warren wore his good coat and had clearly engaged in a serious conversation with a razor that morning, which she noticed and was privately moved by. When Reverend Gale asked if anyone had reason to object, the church was silent except for the wind against the windows, and she thought that was probably as it should be. Warren said his vows in a voice that was low and clear and did not waver. She said hers in the same register and did not look away from his eyes while she said them. Afterward, Pete Gallagher from the general store opened his back room for a small celebration, which grew larger than anyone planned when half the town seemed to find its way through the door on the basis of the word that the Redmond Ranch had finally produced a wedding. There was fiddle music from a man named Calhoun who played by ear and played well, and there was food contributed by half a dozen women who Sarah would come to know well in the years ahead, and there was dancing on the plank floor, and Warren danced with her twice, which, given that he was a man who she had never seen dance before, was an act of genuine courage that she honored. "You are a terrible dancer," she said quietly, while they turned in a slow circle that bore only passing resemblance to the waltz being played. "I know," he said, without apparent distress. "I am a work in progress." "You are," she said, and leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, which made him stand a little straighter, and she smiled at that. They drove home in the dark in the wagon, under a sky so thick with stars it seemed almost physically present, and she sat close beside him on the seat with his arm around her shoulders against the cold, and she had the dollar in her pocket as she always did, and she had his name now legally added to hers, and she had the blue and yellow quilt made by his mother waiting on the bed in the room that was now theirs, and the kitchen garden she had already planned for the spring, and Hector Reyes going ahead of them on horseback to make sure the house was lit and warm. This, she thought, is what it means to belong somewhere. The first winter of their marriage was a hard one, which is to say it was a hard Kansas winter, which means it was genuinely brutal in a way that tested everything. The blizzard that hit in January 1874 blew in from the north with a ferocity that Hector called the worst in 7 years, and they lost 4 head of cattle in the first night before the men could get the herd moved to the more sheltered south pasture. The house held well, the limestone walls earning their worth in that cold, but they were snowbound for 3 days, and the temperature dropped to levels that made the inside of the windows frost over despite the fire in every room. Sarah used those 3 snowbound days to do something she had been planning. She went through the entire household supply situation with the methodical precision that Mrs. Caldecott had always applied to the institutional kitchen's inventory, and she produced a plan, written in the ledger that Warren had given her for household accounts, for how to make the following winter materially better prepared. She noted what they had run short of, what they had had too much of, the points of vulnerability that cold revealed in a working ranch household. When Warren found her at the kitchen table surrounded by ledgers and lists on the second day of the blizzard, he sat down across from her and looked at what she was doing with an attention that was not just affection. "You have a head for supply management," he said. I ran the institutional kitchen for 3 years, she said. 90 people's meals on a limited budget teaches you to think ahead. Would you be willing to manage the ranch supply accounts? He asked. Not just the household, the full operation. She looked up from the ledger. That is a significant responsibility. You are capable of it, he said. I know that and you know that. She thought for a moment. I would want to understand the full operation. Not just the numbers, but what they represent. The cattle, the land, the labor costs. I will teach you everything I know, he said, and you will probably find things I am missing within the first month. She did, in fact, find 3 inefficiencies in the supply chain within the first 6 weeks, which she pointed out with the combination of directness and tact that he was coming to understand was her particular social intelligence at work. He implemented all 3 changes. One of them saved enough to fund a new piece of equipment for the barn that he had been trying to justify for 2 years. Spring came in March, tentatively, the way Kansas spring arrived, testing the ground with warm days and then retreating again for a week of cold before making a genuine commitment. Sarah planted the kitchen garden in April with serious intent, beans and squash and corn and a long row of root vegetables, and a small bed of herbs that she had ordered from a seed catalog Pete Gallagher stocked. She planted a fruit tree on the south side of the house, an apple, because she was thinking ahead. Warren watched her plant the tree on a warm Saturday morning and said, "That tree will take 5 years to bear fruit." "I know," she said. "You are planning to be here in 5 years," he said, as if this was something wonderful. She looked at him over her shoulder, dirt on her hands, the small tree standing in its freshly dug hole. "I am planning to be here in 50, she said. He came and helped her finish settling the tree into the ground, and it was one of the best mornings she would remember from that first year, the 2 of them on their knees in the spring dirt doing work that was small and permanent and hopeful. Hector had a woman in town, a widow named Rosa Fuentes, who ran a small dressmaking operation, and who came to supper at the ranch 3 or 4 times before she and Sarah discovered they had a substantial affinity for each other, and the frequency of those suppers doubled. Rosa was sharp and funny and pragmatic and had been in Kansas for 12 years, and she knew things about the territory and its people and its unwritten rules that Sarah absorbed eagerly, because knowledge was the best protection available and she had always known that. "Does he know you keep the dollar?" Rosa asked one afternoon, over coffee in the kitchen while the men were out on the range. "He does," Sarah said. "He told me to keep it always." Rosa looked at her steadily. "That is a man who does not need you to need him," she said. "That is the kind worth keeping." "I know," Sarah said. "Most women out here do not have that," Rosa said, without self-pity but with the particular clarity of someone who has observed the world carefully. "Most women out here are here because they had no choice at all. You had no choice in coming, but you have choices now and you are still here. That is different." "It is different," Sarah agreed, and she meant it. The summer of 1874 brought 2 significant things to the Redmond Ranch. The first was a formal letter from the land office in Topeka confirming that Warren's claim on the marsh property had been approved, adding 160 acres to the operation, which he immediately put to work as extended grazing land, and which changed the mathematics of the cattle operation substantially for the better. The second was Sarah's understanding, confirmed by the doctor in Caldwell on a warm July afternoon, that she was expecting a child. She told Warren that evening. They were on the porch after supper, as they often were in the summer evenings, watching the long prairie sunset paint itself in oranges and pinks across a sky that was never modest with its colors. "I am going to need to reorganize the kitchen," she said. He looked at her. "For what reason?" "Because by spring I am going to have less range of motion and more things to account for," she said, "and I want to do it before I have to rather than while I have to." He was quiet for a moment, working out what she had said, and then his expression did something she had never quite seen before, a complete openness, every careful layer he kept between himself and the world simply gone for a moment, pure feeling all the way down. "Sarah," he said. "We are going to need to find someone to help in the house next spring," she said, because she was practical and because she needed to say something practical while he looked at her that way, or she was going to embarrass herself. "And I want to speak to Rosa about the quilt, because she is better with a needle than I am and I have ideas." He reached over and covered her hand with his, the third time he had done that, the gesture that had become theirs, meaningful in the sequence of moments it belonged to. "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. "Doc Hensley is pleased with things." "Good," he said. He brought her hand up and pressed it to his lips, a gesture that was completely uncharacteristic of his habitual economy of expression, and therefore made it more, not less. "Good," he said again, against her hand. He told Hector the next morning, and she could hear from the kitchen the particular quality of Hector's whoop that was clearly audible through 3 closed doors, and was followed by what sounded like him slapping Warren on the back hard enough to dislodge something. Rosa came that week, ostensibly to discuss the quilt, actually to deliver her congratulations and her considerable knowledge of pregnancy management on the frontier, which was more immediately useful than any quilt. She and Sarah sat for 3 hours at the kitchen table with cups of coffee going cold beside them, and Rosa was both honest about the difficulties and clear about the manageable nature of them, which was exactly what Sarah needed and would have expected from Rosa. The fall of 1874 was beautiful. Kansas fall had that quality sometimes, a clarity of air and color, the prairie grass going gold and amber, the sky a specific shade of blue that existed nowhere else she had seen. Sarah moved through it with the particular heightened awareness of someone whose body is doing something large and world-altering, the kind of awareness that made ordinary things luminous. Warren was careful with her without being overprotective, which was exactly the right calibration, and she knew it was not accidental. He had thought about it, she could tell, had worked out what kind of care was wanted and what kind would chafe, and he had landed in the right place, which was thoughtful attention without the removal of her autonomy, and she loved him for that more specifically than she could say. She said it one October evening, as directly as she always said things. "I love you," she said. They were in the sitting room, she with her sewing and he with the quarterly accounts, and it came out simply, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary evening, which was the right way for it to come out. He looked up from the accounts. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to think of as his real face, the one without any of the layers, just Warren, just the person underneath everything, and then he said, "I have loved you since about the 3rd morning when you told me about Mrs. Prine boiling everything until it asked for mercy." She laughed. "That is a completely absurd thing to love someone at." "I know," he said, "but it was when I knew. I love you, Sarah." She went back to her sewing and he went back to his accounts, and the fire crackled in the hearth, and outside the wind moved across the prairie, and the house held them, solid and warm, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world arranged correctly. Their son was born on the 14th of March, 1875, in the bedroom of the limestone house, with Doc Hensley in attendance and Rosa Fuentes holding Sarah's hand and Warren pacing the kitchen below, with Hector sitting at the table pretending to drink coffee, but mostly watching Warren pace. The labor was long but not complicated, which was what Doc Hensley said afterward, and which Sarah suspected was an understatement of some kind, but chose to accept at face value. When the child finally announced himself with the particular authority of a healthy newborn, the sound reached the kitchen and Warren stopped pacing and stood in the middle of the room with his eyes briefly closed. Doc Hensley came to the top of the stairs and said, "A boy, Mr. Redmond. Both doing very well." Warren was up the stairs before Doc Hensley finished the sentence. She was propped against the pillows with the child in her arms, tired to her bones and incandescent with something she had no name for yet, and when he came through the door and stopped at the sight of them, she watched him take the picture in, watched it settle into him, watched it change him. He came to the bedside and looked at the baby and then at her and said nothing, because nothing was the right response. He touched the child's face with one careful finger, the same deliberate gentleness that he brought to every significant thing, and the baby's hand moved in sleep, the tiny fingers spreading. "He has your hands," she said. "Look at his hands." "He has your chin," he said. "He is going to be extremely stubborn." "That is optimistic," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and took her free hand and held it, and they looked at their son together, the three of them in the lamplight, while outside the March wind moved across the prairie, and the apple tree Sarah had planted the previous spring stood in the yard, still years from its first fruit, already worth the wait. They named him Thomas James Redmond, Thomas for Warren's father, James for the minister at the Illinois church where Sarah's mother Catherine was known to have been baptized, which was a piece of information Rosa had helped her track down through correspondence with a circuit minister who knew the old records. Thomas James was a vigorous, opinionated child from the first week, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined jaw, and he announced his opinions about the world loudly and with conviction, which everyone agreed was a Blackwell trait. The Redmond ranch grew. That was the only word for it, the steady expansion of something well tended, the way a tree grows, adding rings of substance each year without drama but without pause. They added cattle to the operation over the years following, added a horse breeding program that became, to Warren's satisfaction and Sarah's careful financial management, a significant secondary income. They repaired and improved the house, adding a proper parlor in 1876 and expanding the kitchen in 1877 to the dimensions that Sarah had been planning in her head since about the third week of her residence there. Hector married Rosa Fuentes on a warm day in May 1876, in the same Methodist church where Warren and Sarah had married, and Sarah stood with Rosa, and Warren stood with Hector, and Tomás and Luis Vega sat in the same front pew looking even more pleased with themselves, if possible. After the ceremony, Sarah hugged Rosa and held on a moment longer than she had expected to, and Rosa said, quietly, "You are the best thing that ever rode a train into this territory," which was the kind of thing Rosa said that sounded like a joke and was not a joke at all. The second child came in the spring of 1878, a girl this time, with Sarah's coloring and Warren's steady temperament, who they named Margaret Catherine Redmond after both their mothers, which pleased Sarah in a way that went deep, the long threads connecting properly at last. Thomas, who was 3 and extremely proprietary about his position in the household, spent the first week of his sister's life conducting a serious investigation into whether she was a permanent arrangement before finally determining that she was acceptable, a decision he announced to Warren with great solemnity. In the evenings that year, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Warren and Sarah had taken to sitting on the porch as they always had, in the warm months, watching the prairie dark, talking about the things that the daytime was too busy for. These evenings had become the most important time of her days, the specific luxury of it, the two of them alone with the whole conversation of their lives available to them. "Do you remember the dollar?" he asked one September evening, their 5th anniversary approaching. "I carry it still," she said. She reached into her apron pocket, which was not the gray wool dress pocket of the train journey but a good calico apron over a proper dress that was hers, bought with her own money from her own account at Pete Gallagher's store, and she held up the dollar coin in the lamplight from the window. He took it from her and turned it over in his fingers, the way he had not done that first day on the train platform, the way she had not let anyone do until him. "This is the one you had when you arrived." "Yes," she said. "The first thing that was ever only yours," he said, echoing her words from the night he proposed. "And the last of the things I owned before I owned anything here," she said. "I keep it to remember what the starting point was, where I came from." He turned it over once more and handed it back, and she put it back in her apron pocket, and he put his arm around her on the porch seat and she leaned against him, and the Kansas stars were doing their usual extraordinary thing overhead. "What was the name stitched inside the collar?" he asked. I read it that day and I have never forgotten it. Sarah Blackwell in blue thread. The matron stitched all the names in, she said. So the laundry would not get mixed. I always hated it. It felt like being catalogued. But it was the strangest piece of luck, wasn't it? That I wore the dress that day with that name in the collar and that you saw it and that you went pale. I nearly said something right there at the counter, he said. I nearly said your name is Blackwell and I went to school with a boy whose mother was Margaret Blackwell and she talked about a sister. I nearly said it and then I thought I had misread, that it couldn't be real. But it was real, she said. It was, he said. She turned her head and looked at his profile, the familiar shape of it now as known to her as the shape of the kitchen, the barn, the morning sky. She had memorized him the way she memorized practical things, carefully and with full attention, and what she had was not just the surface of him but the whole substance. I am glad I wore that dress, she said. I am glad Pete Gallagher had a draft from the door that day, he said. That turned your collar up. I am glad Gerald Marsh wrote to Mrs. Pryor, she said. I am glad the train ran on time, he said. I am glad the dollar lasted long enough, she said, and he laughed against her hair. They sat until the lamp in the window burned down low, and the stars began their slow revolution overhead, and the prairie was dark and enormous around them, and the house behind them was warm and full of life, and neither of them moved to go inside because there was nowhere better to be than exactly here. The Redmond Ranch in the fall of 1879 was one of the more prosperous small operations in that part of Kansas, which was the result of 6 years of consistent work and careful management, and the particular combination of Warren's ability with land and animals and Sarah's ability with numbers and planning and the human relationships that made a community rather than just a collection of properties. They were known in Caldwell and the surrounding territory as fair-dealing people, which was the highest compliment the territory paid, and their dinner table was known as a place where you were likely to find an interesting variety of company on any given evening. Thomas was 4 now, and Margaret was 18 months, and the house was rarely quiet but was generally happy in its noise. The kind of household that had argument and spilled milk and boots left in wrong places, and also a great deal of laughter and the smell of good food, and the sense that everyone in it was exactly where they were supposed to be. Rosa came twice a week, and had become so integrated into the life of the household that the distinction between friend and family had long since ceased to have meaning. Hector and Rosa had a daughter of their own now, a girl named Clara who was 6 months older than Margaret, and who the two babies regarded each other with the solemn interest of very small people who are deciding whether to be friends, which they decisively were. On a warm afternoon in October, Sarah was in the kitchen garden pulling the last of the autumn turnips when Thomas came running from the direction of the barn at the particular velocity that indicated excitement rather than emergency, and Warren was behind him, coming more slowly with a smile that was already in his eyes before it reached his face. "Mama," Thomas shouted, "Papa says the apple tree is going to have apples." She stood up from the garden and looked at the south side of the house, and the apple tree she had planted in the spring of her first year was heavy with small green apples just beginning to blush, 5 years of growth bearing its first real fruit exactly as planned. She had not been tracking it consciously, or not only consciously, but of course she had known, the same way she knew the state of the larder and the balance of the household accounts and the temperature of the kitchen range and the specific quality of light that meant Warren was about to say something important. She had been watching that tree with peripheral attention for 5 years. "Well," she said, "I did say it would." Warren came up beside her and stood looking at the tree with Thomas between them, the boy's hand in his, and he looked at Sarah over Thomas's head with an expression that contained everything they had built together, all the years and the work and the particular joy of it. "You said you would be here in 50 years, he said. "I did," she said. "We will need to plant more trees," he said. "I have been thinking about that," she said. "I want to add a pear tree and a cherry tree along the east side next spring." He laughed, and Thomas looked up at his father with the bright, investigating gaze of a 4-year-old who is learning that the world is interesting. And Margaret's voice came from inside the house where she had been napping, the early stirring sound of a child waking to discover she was hungry. And Sarah went inside to get her daughter, and Warren stayed in the yard with Thomas showing him the tree. And this was her life, and she wanted nothing else from it except more of it. Later that evening, Thomas in bed and Margaret nursed and settled. They were in the kitchen together in the lamplight. She was writing in the household ledger, and he was reading a letter from the Cattle Association in Topeka, and the range had a pot of something on it for tomorrow, and the house smelled of the day's cooking and the dried herbs hanging from the kitchen ceiling and the particular smell that was the house itself, stone and wood and years of good fires. She put down the pen and looked at him. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked up from the letter. "I came off that train with $1 and my name in my collar," she said. "I had been told, all my life in one way or another, that I was without family and without property and without significance to anyone in particular. I believed it for a long time because the evidence supported it." She paused. "I want you to know that I no longer believe it. I have not believed it for a long time. And I want you to know that it is directly because of you, not because you gave me things, but because you showed me what it was to be known, really known, the way you know someone when you pay attention to them as if they matter." He was very still across the table. "You read my name in a collar," she said, "and you went pale. And then you looked at me and you offered me honest work, and then you told me the truth about what you had seen, and then you gave me a reason to be somewhere that was worth being. And I want you to know that every part of that was a gift, and I have not taken any of it for granted, and I will not." He closed the letter and set it on the table and looked at her with the full, open expression that was his real face, the one without layers, just himself. "Sarah," he said, "you built this as much as I did, you know that." "I know that now," she said. "It took me a while to know it. I was used to being temporary, used to being passage." "You are not passage," he said. "You are the center of it. You are the whole point." She smiled at him. "That is a great deal of pressure to put on a cook," she said. He laughed, which was what she had been going for, and stood up from the table and came around to her side, and she turned her face up, and he kissed her in the lamplight kitchen with the herbs overhead and the pot on the range and their children asleep in the rooms above them. And it was not the first time he had kissed her, or the 100th, or the 1,000th. But every time she registered it as the specific gift it was, the choosing of each other. The continuous rechoosing that is what love actually is in practice as opposed to theory. That spring they planted the pear tree and the cherry tree along the east side of the house. Thomas helped with the digging with a small shovel of his own, serious and thorough, and Margaret watched from the quilt spread on the grass with Clara Ray's, the two girls engaged in the investigation of a particularly interesting beetle. Warren set each tree with care, the same care he brought to every permanent thing, and Sarah pressed the earth down around the last one and stood up and looked at the 3 fruit trees lined along the house, and the kitchen garden beyond them, and the prairie opening out to the south and the north, with the enormous sky overhead. "How many more years before these bear?" Thomas asked. 5 or 6, Sarah said. Thomas considered this with the seriousness of a 5-year-old doing long arithmetic. "I will be 10, he said, "or 11. "You will," she said. "That is a long time to wait," he said. "Some things are worth waiting a long time for," she said. She looked at Warren, who was watching her with the quiet, attentive eyes that knew her. "Some things are absolutely worth the wait." He came and stood beside her, and Thomas announced that he was going to go tell Hector about the new trees, and ran in the direction of the barn, and Margaret patted the grass with great satisfaction, and Clara tried to show her the beetle again, and Sarah and Warren stood in the spring morning in their yard with their trees and their life around them. She had arrived with $1 and a name stitched in blue thread, sent west by a woman who thought she was solving a problem and was actually, in the unplanned way of things, setting the longest thread of Sarah's life in motion. She had arrived uncertain and alone and braced for disappointment, and what she had found instead was a man who read a name in a collar and went pale with recognition, who looked at her and saw family, and then something more than family, and who had spent every year since proving that what he saw was worth seeing. She reached into her pocket and felt the edge of the silver dollar, smooth and worn with years of handling. First thing that was ever only mine. She had so many things now, things built and earned and chosen, but she kept the dollar for the same reason she had always kept it, to remember that she had arrived with enough. $1 and her own name and the stubbornness to walk into a general store and ask for what she needed. That had been enough to begin with, and what you begin with matters because it is the root of everything that comes after. She took Warren's hand without looking at him, because she did not need to look to find him, and he laced his fingers through hers, and they stood in the Kansas spring morning in the yard of the ranch they had built together, and the sky was enormous and blue and full of promise, and the apple tree on the south side of the house was already leafing out with the confident assurance of something that has found good ground and intends to keep growing. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had been exactly where she was supposed to be for a long time now, since the moment a tall man turned from a counter in a Kansas general store and read a name stitched in blue thread inside a gray wool collar and went pale with recognition, and a woman with $1 in her pocket and nothing else to her name looked back at him and decided that honest work with an honest man was worth the risk of staying. It was the best decision she had ever made. It was the one she would make again every day for the rest of her life. The dollar stayed in her pocket. Warren's hand stayed in hers. The trees grew. The children grew. The ranch grew. The sky stayed enormous above the Kansas plain, the way it always had, the way it would keep on doing long after all of them, watching over the grass and the cattle and the limestone houses and the small determined apple trees, and the lives of the people who planted them and waited patiently for what was coming, because they trusted from long experience that what was coming was worth waiting for.